Hey y'all, it's Amy. Today I'm going to talk about The Empire Strikes Back, the sequel to Star Wars, which is later called Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope, so this is Episode 5, Empire Strikes Back. The Empire Strikes Back was released in 1980, 3 years after A New Hope, and it's widely regarded as the best of the Star Wars films. So let's just jump right in and start with Part 1, Sequels. What makes a sequel good? Why do some sequels succeed, and in some cases even surpass the original work, and others, well, don't? There's no real formula for the success of a sequel, but sequels in general work best when they expand upon the original work in a way that's consistent, but not repetitive or derivative. A good sequel teaches us something new about the world or some of the characters within it, or it continues the plot and brings the story closer to its resolution. And why do some sequels fail? Well, there are a few reasons. For new creators or new properties, the existence of a sequel can't be assumed. The first part of a story, whether that be a single film, book, or season of a TV show, necessarily has to be able to stand alone. Since the creator is bound by having to create something that makes sense in the first arc on its own, creating a satisfying sequel can be a challenge, especially if there wasn't initially one envisioned. Some of these sequels fail because they're too much of a rehash or repeat of the original work. Other sequels might fail because they feel too different from the original work, because it doesn't seem enough of the original story or the original characters are maintained. This especially happens when the sequel is greenlit without the involvement of the original crew, and so the quality takes a huge dip. George Lucas was hopeful from the beginning that Star Wars would get a sequel, but the development and production of Empire were somewhat fraught. There were several rewrites to the script, there were issues with delays and injuries on set, especially when they were filming the scenes in Norway or Hoth. There were health issues among the cast and budget issues that led George Lucas to take on financing the film himself through his studio Lucasfilm. But eventually the sequel did come out, and the reviews were actually mixed, which is pretty surprising because, as I said, Empire is now widely regarded as the best and strongest of the Star Wars films. But initially, the reviews didn't really like the change in tone, and I could kind of see what they were saying when I rewatched the film. The tone in the first movie is pretty lighthearted. In my last video, I talked a little bit about how, despite the fact that a lot of people are dying and there are a couple of pretty gruesome moments, the film just kind of keeps moving past that. They give us a moment with Luke to see his reaction, but we're not really bogged down in the gore and the death and the destruction and the fear. We're pretty hopeful, I guess. And just moving right along. I don't think that Empire is necessarily bogged down, but it definitely feels a bit more serious. It even says in the opening crawl that this is a dark time for the rebellion, and it feels like the rebellion's not doing so hot. In the first film, they felt disadvantaged, but they've got a plan to bring down the Empire, they've got the plans for the Death Star, they got a plan to get those to the right people, and you just know that they're going to find a vulnerability and that they're going to be able to destroy that old Death Star before any more planets are destroyed. And they do, and it's a great victory for them, but the threat hasn't been completely eliminated. They've had a few years to regroup and to rebuild, and they've rebuilt the secret base on Hoth. And while they have a pretty sophisticated operation on Hoth, they have to dismantle it almost immediately, within the first few minutes of the movie, because they've been discovered again, and they're on the run again. And you get a sense that everything that they'd worked for up to this point kind of didn't work out. Whatever plan they had, whatever strikes they were making against the Empire, didn't have much of an impact. And while our main characters have clearly moved up the ranks and have become important members of the rebellion as a whole feels kind of hopeless when we start this film. The tone is just darker than the original. The interactions with the characters feel a lot more consequential and also more mature. And in a lot of ways, it feels like an older movie for an older audience. There are still some silly, light scenes in it, especially when we meet Yoda for the first time, but there's not much else here for the kids who were entertained and amused by the first film, going along with Luke on his hero's journey and really stepping into his shoes, feeling like they were going to get their lightsabers out and take on the world. You can see how they would be less satisfied by this entry. I think a decent comparison is the tone and the feel of the first Harry Potter book and movie, when Harry's just 11 years old, versus the fourth film, when he's really starting to grow up. There's a real danger in the first Harry Potter book. There's the threat that Voldemort is going to come to the school and he's going to kill Harry and all of his friends, but mostly it's just fun. Harry's learning magic and he's making friends and he's fighting bullies and he's playing Quidditch and he's just out there having a good time being 11 years old. It's fun, and it's light, and it's silly, and the conflict is resolved fairly simply through things that a bunch of first-year students know how to do, which... I'll leave that alone for now. Empire feels roughly like the fourth Harry Potter book. Everyone is older, and the conflict feels like it has greater stakes and consequences for the people in Harry's circle, in the same way that the danger Luke and his friends are facing feels more real in Empire. Harry's in over his head, and thematically, Goblet of Fire has some similarity, I think, to Empire Strikes Back, where the odds are not in their favor.
The possibility of successfully navigating an asteroid field is approximately 3,720 to 1!
Never tell me the odds.
Everything's kind of rigged against them from the beginning. And also, the characters are starting to be interested in each other romantically in Goblet of Fire, which is definitely also a major focus of Empire, but more on that later. But I can see where the departure in tone upset people who are expecting more of the same, and the change in the story structure where Luke is largely isolated for this one, not with the ragtag group of heroes fighting in the rebellion running away from Darth Vader, also was probably disappointing for people wanting to see more of Luke with his friends. But I think all of the changes were ultimately for the better. Empire is an excellent expansion of the original material. Instead of trying to rehash the exact same story that they'd already told, and told really well, they moved to a different type of story that's more focused on character. And that's a good transition to my next part. Part 2. Plot and character. I remember watching Empire as a kid and getting to the scene at the end where Luke is getting his hand fixed, and he's there with Leia and R2-D2 and C-3PO, and they're looking out into space, and then the credits roll. And I remember being like, wait, what? That was it? Like, where's the rest of the movie? It felt like there was going to be more, because while Luke had fought Darth Vader, it was kind of a draw. I mean, Luke lost, but he didn't die. And so I thought that he'd be facing Darth Vader again. And I think that this is a film where not a whole lot really happens when you think about it. When you try to describe the plot, you can do so in a couple of sentences. The rebels are on the run from Darth Vader, and after they're initially discovered, the group splits. Luke goes and trains with Yoda, while the rest of the rebels just remain on the run until the end, when they're caught in a trap to lure Luke into facing Darth Vader. That's pretty much it. It introduces a couple of new characters, Lando and Boba Fett, but at the end of Empire Strikes Back, everyone is more or less in the same position as they were in the beginning, except for Han, who's been frozen in carbonite and is now being delivered to Jabba, but everyone else is kind of in the same place. They're still on the run from Darth Vader. Darth Vader still rules the galaxy, sort of. He's a conduit of the Emperor, who is introduced in this film after being only briefly mentioned in the first, but despite the fact that the plot hasn't really moved forward very much, this is a really important film for character development. It's about developing the characters into a place where they're ready to advance the story. And I think that was fairly necessary in order to get to a satisfying conclusion to this trilogy. We only really get to see the outlines of the characters in the first film. We get to see the different archetypes. Luke is the typical hero, the do-gooder who finds his place in the story through the hero's journey. At the end of A New Hope, he listens to Obi-Wan about using the Force, and through it, he guides the missiles to destroy the Death Star. And I guess they could have left it as simple as that. Luke is just a good Force user now, if not fully fledged Jedi, and he knows how to use the Force, and it was actually that easy all along. But I feel like that would have been kind of a cop-out, and people would have had the same criticism about Luke as they did about Rey for unearned and overly convenient abilities. Like, all he has to do is believe in himself and the Force, and he can do anything. And I think that would be pretty unsatisfying to see. So Luke's character development, his arc, is walked back a little here. And it kind of has to be, because he has his initial victory and he uses the Force that one time and it works. They need him to get to that place by the end of the first film, or otherwise the first film doesn't have a good conclusion. But now to face Darth Vader one-on-one, they need him to get to the next level, and for him to become a Jedi Knight. And to do so, he has to overcome his doubts and fears in his training with Yoda, in spite of the fact that he didn't really seem to have any doubts before this point. And I think that kind of backsliding is realistic for the way we learn things. Most of us do have to go a few steps forward, a few steps back when we're learning something new, especially something scary or dangerous. Also, they do justify it in universe by saying that through Luke's anger, presumably over the murder of Obi-Wan by Darth Vader, he's being drawn to the dark side of the Force. You can kind of see where Luke got himself through to the end of the Death Star battle, basically just on adrenaline. But now, after several years have passed, he's had time to process the death of Obi-Wan and the duel with Darth Vader. He watched someone murdered before his eyes. someone that he respected and had grown to really admire, and who probably felt like the first real father figure that he had. I mean, there was Uncle Owen, but he was cold and practical and kind of a dick. So maybe Obi-Wan felt like a father figure to Luke, and watching him get murdered had an impact on him. And so you can understand why he's angry and why he's after this revenge. I feel like he really needed the development in this film to help him move past that, and also to transform him into someone who's ready to take on Darth Vader, and ultimately help redeem him in the next movie. So it's a really good development for Luke. I'll talk a little bit more about the actual training and everything with Yoda in a minute, but first I want to talk about our other main characters, Leia and Han, in a section I'm calling Part 3, the Romantic Subplot. Let's talk about love.
Let's talk about love.
So is it just me, or is everyone pretty horny in this movie?
I can't. It's too big. Size matters not.
I mean, I feel like there's some little moments and things in the first film, and there are some sweet chaste kisses, but man, like, everybody in this film is just kind of down to fuck.
Size matters not.
And again, this is something I didn't really notice or understand as a kid. And when I saw the end result of Han and Leia kissing and all that, I was just really confused by the whole thing. But watching it as an adult, I don't hate it. I actually think that this romance works pretty well. Better than pretty much every other Star Wars romance. Not that that's a super high bar. I mean, I do have a soft spot for Reylo, but we can talk about that later. Let's get back to Leia, our action princess. In the first film, she's the damsel in distress, sort of, but she's also competent and an essential part of the story and not just a victim of it. She actually has more political importance and importance to the plot than most of the other characters in the beginning. And then, of course, you have Han Solo, who started A New Hope as a mercenary type, and his character arc in the first film shows how he goes from someone who's motivated by money to someone who's motivated by his connection with his new friends in the rebellion. How and why did these two people from different worlds end up together? The original intention of the script was for Han and Luke and Leia to be in the dreaded love triangle. You can still see the outlines of that in the moment where Leia kisses Luke in the beginning. Han and Luke are meant to be romantic rivals for her affection. This plays out kind of like the love triangle in the Hunger Games. In the first book, the relationship develops between Peeta and Katniss, and then Katniss's relationship with Gale develops in the second book, Catching Fire. They explore the possibility of a Luke-Leia romance in A New Hope, where they have a couple of moments during the Death Star escape, and now they're giving Han his shot in Empire. And you can imagine a story in which they have her torn in the third movie between her options. Is she going to choose the good boy hero who's like all the guys she always imagined she'd end up with? Or is she going to go with this bad boy rogue type? And I'm kind of glad that they more or less put a pin in that and decided that no, Han and Leia are the one true pair. Han and Luke's rivalry over Leia would have detracted from their friendship. And while Luke and Leia have a strong connection, the development of the Han and Leia relationship in Empire works better, even if it's a little formulaic. The formula is pretty basic, it's pretty standard, but it works. And it's a lot better than most romances that we get today. You start with some meaningful glances between characters. Those longing stares at each other from across the room. The like, oh, there they are. The moments in the middle of scenes where they're just like looking at each other. There's a lot of these actually. And they're just kind of like, And then you throw in a couple of dashes of physical contact in sort of a somewhat problematic way. I'll talk about that a little more in a second. And then you add in a whole bunch of bickering and fighting and banter, and you mix it all up in a dire life or death situation, and bam, you have love. And sure, it's nothing new, but our modern versions of romance kind of skip a lot of these steps. Romance is criminally underwritten in pretty much everything except for romance movies, maybe. And even there, it can be painful to watch because the actors don't have chemistry, or the situation is too contrived and the character's too hollow. We'll get the meaningful glances maybe, and that's kind of it. I love romance. And I also hate it in almost everything that I watch, which is really frustrating. I love a really well done romantic storyline between two characters that have a lot of chemistry and a compelling reason for being together. I get super caught up in it, but I've seen far too many of what I guess you could call the Avril Lavigne theory of romance, which is he was a boy and she was a girl. Can I make it any more obvious? There's a lot of that. There's a lot of just like a guy and a girl looking at each other, and that's all we get. And then they're just together now. And I think this is part of why slash or same gender pairings are so popular among shippers in the fanfic community. A lot more goes into developing relationships between same gender characters, where the shortcut of the longing stare doesn't work, at least not in the heteronormative world we live in. Side note, there's a scene in this that feels a little loaded, let's say.
It's too big. Size matters not.
Between Han and Luke. I think this must have been Mark Hamill flubbing a line. It's the only thing I can think of that makes this make sense, because there's an interaction and they're just looking back and forth at each other. And Mark is Luke. He goes like, just like start speaking and he's gonna say something and then he doesn't. I imagine there was a line there for him to say and that he just forgot it. But then they kept this taken because there's this really nice moment of Han and Luke just looking at each other, and it reads like they were going to admit something, but they don't really need to say it out loud. They're saying to each other, be careful out there and thanks for having my back. I hope that we get through this alive because I care about you. But these aren't the kind of guys to say that to each other. And so they have this moment where they're looking back and forth, and if you read it as just we care about each other, that's nice. But it's really easy to look at that moment and to see something else. I'm not saying that I'm going to go and write a Luke and Han slash fanfic like right now, but I definitely get that vibe a little bit from that moment in that interaction. And I don't hate it, romantic or not. I just think it's funny that the typical straight romantic formula of two attractive people glancing at each other makes it possible to read scenes like this differently than they may have been intended. But back to Han and Leia. I'm okay with the kind of formulaic romance they have in this film. I think that it works particularly well for these two characters because they're both strong-willed, strong-headed characters who are just not going to openly admit how they feel to each other. They're just not. 3 years have passed since they met, and it's interesting how little's really happened in that 3-year time period. Han still hasn't gone and paid that bounty off. He has the money, I think. I guess he just didn't get around to it. Or maybe he couldn't leave her, which is also a little hard to understand because it doesn't really seem like the distance of space really matters in this universe, or that he would be away from her or the rebellion for a long period of time. It kind of feels like he could be like, well, see ya. I'm gonna go for a couple of days and pay off this debt so people aren't trying to kill me anymore, and then I'll come back and be here with you and the rebellion. But I think that actual reason he doesn't go is because he's trying to get Leia to ask him to stay. And not just ask him to stay because he's important to the rebellion, but to ask him to stay because she wants him to stay. And this is where the movie starts, and it's pretty clear that Han has developed feelings for Princess Leia, but somebody hurt him. Like, somebody messed this guy up. It's probably in Solo. I haven't seen that movie yet. I guess I'll eventually know. But anyway, Han is just not the kind of person who can say how he feels, and so he needs to get Princess Leia to admit how she feels. And I think it's partially because he's scared. If he's vulnerable with her, if he takes the risk and shows his cards and he's rejected, that would absolutely destroy the image he has of himself as this cool, detached guy who doesn't really care. He's just kind of along for the ride. He's a cool dude. So if he admits this weakness, at least a weakness in his eyes, and she doesn't reciprocate, it would completely shatter his self-image. And so I think he goes through this whole thing where he's trying to be like, you feel it. I know you feel it. You want me to stay for you. And Leia pretty much acts like she doesn't know what he's talking about.
I don't know what you're talking about.
And I think this is part of why I didn't really see their romantic relationship when I was younger, because she doesn't really act like it's reciprocated for quite some time. And I think that can read a little problematic in modern times because he doesn't really seem to respect her boundaries. He pushes her to confess to him even after she's basically said, stop, please, I don't want you to keep talking about this. Can you stop bringing it up? It's kind of uncomfortable for me to watch. He holds her too long in the physical contact situations that they get into, and she seems genuinely unhappy about that.
Let go. Shh. Let go, please.
It's not framed where she has a moment where she's like, oh, this feels good, but no, I can't. We don't really get that impression. She seems genuinely uncomfortable. I feel like they could have given us just a tiny hint more than just the meaningful glances before she does give in to him to show that she's actually into it and that this isn't just a one-way street where Han is just bothering her. I have a similar criticism of Futurama because as much as I love Fry and Leela, there's some episodes in there where Leela just acts completely annoyed that Fry is trying to get with her. There's one where he keeps trying it on and she's like, just stop. I'll never feel that way about you.
Stop. I don't want to hurt you, but there is absolutely, positively no way that you and I will ever Whatever.
Man and wife.
And you do feel like he's a nuisance in that moment. And it's hard to ship them together while he's just being annoying and won't respect her boundaries and won't leave her alone. And I think most women, and probably people of all genders, have had this experience before, and it's not fun. It's really uncomfortable. And especially if it's someone that you have to work with or someone that you're trying to be friends with, and they're not taking no for an answer and they're not respecting your decision, it can really make things awkward and uncomfortable for you. And so I wish they'd given us like just a tiny bit more of a moment where it felt like Leia really did care for him as more than just a friend and more than just her ally in the rebellion. Although I do love watching Han's frustration that she won't admit her feelings. There's a moment in the beginning where Han says something to her that reminds me a lot of Rhett Butler and Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. It's one of their very first interactions when he's asking her to ask him to stay, and he says something as he's leaving. He's off screen, but he's like, "You could use a kiss."
Use a good kiss.
And it's really similar to a scene in Gone with the Wind when Rhett Butler's like, "You should be kissed, and often, and by someone who knows how."
You should be kissed and often, and by someone who knows how.
Neither Rhett nor Han are able to say, "I want to kiss you," because they're too prideful. So they have to frame it as, "No, I won't kiss you, but you need a kiss." But also the notion of needing a kiss, and that the problem with a woman is that she's not being kissed enough and she's too frigid, I guess. I don't love that. I don't love that idea that this strong-headed, cold woman can be fixed if she's being kissed by the right guy. So that's kind of a less generous take on that. But you could also take it from a sort of romantic sense, like you would be better off if you were in a fulfilling romantic relationship with someone, and that's what you really need. So that's kind of the nicer way of looking at it. But anyway, Han, he's got it bad, man. Han has really got it bad in the beginning of this film, and he reminds me somewhat of Lloyd Dobler in Say Anything, or even Noah in The Notebook, where he's just in over his head, like absolutely head over heels for this woman, but he needs her to reciprocate. The difference is that Lloyd and Noah are open with how they feel, like they've told their partners, they're just waiting for the reciprocation to happen. But Han, he is just not that type, and he's still not, even when he's basically won. He was right about Princess Leia's feelings, and she does reciprocate them, and she does kiss him back, and she does admit that she sees some sort of value in him. And then finally, when they're faced with the possibility of his death, when they aren't sure if he's going to survive the carbon freezing, she does confess her feelings for him, and she comes out and she says, "I love you." And you get a sense too that this is tough for Leia's character as well. You know she's also scared of this, and that making this kind of confession in this moment is scary because she doesn't view Han as the type of guy that she typically goes for. I think she can see through someone like Han, to see his manipulations and his come-ons and everything for what they are. But I also think she's smart enough to be able to see the man underneath and that heart of gold that all of us see in Han, the version of him that really does care for her and for Luke and for everyone. She wants to believe in that person, and she wants to trust in him, but she's scared that she's wrong, and that if she is wrong, she could really end up hurt here. But ultimately, she faces it, and I think that makes sense too, that she's the one to face her fears and to admit her feelings, especially in the face of death. She's just not willing to let that go unsaid. And Han's response there is so utterly perfect.
I love you.
I know.
It was an improvised scene. The original script said, "I love you too." And I think no one could really hear that coming out of Harrison Ford's mouth in that moment. It just wouldn't work for Han Solo. It can and does work later, but he's just not there yet. He's gotten what he wanted, which is for Leia to admit her feelings, but in that moment, there hasn't been enough time for him to feel safe enough to admit his own. I think Leia knows, and I think he knows himself what he's feeling, but to say the words out loud, especially in front of everyone, is just not Han. Not yet. So I think his "I know" response there is just so good. It works so well too because of the way he says it and the way that you can see on his face that he loves her. Like, he's not saying, "I know, like, of course you love me. I knew it all along. I got you to admit it. You fell for my trap." He's not mocking her. He's not putting her down. He's not giving her this dissatisfying answer because he wants some power or control over her. It's more about his own feelings and his doubts and his insecurities, fears that he has, and who he views himself as, and what a threat she could pose to that. And so I think it makes sense that he's just not ready to display that vulnerability yet. And I love this romance. I think it really works, but it's not the only meaningful connection in the story. Part 4, Connections. So a lot of the characters within this have pretty great connections with each other, other than just the romantic connection between Han and Leia. Han saves Luke in the opening of this film, which is a terrific scene because Luke manages to save himself from the Wampa first before Han rescues him from exposure. In another fairly gruesome moment I'd forgotten when I said barbecued Aunt Owen and Aunt Beru were as graphic as it gets. The Tauntaun sleeping bag situation is disgusting and memorable, and once again gives Han something to do without making Luke seem useless or incompetent. This is, of course, the second time Han has saved Luke's life after the last-minute trench run intervention in New Hope, and you definitely get the sense that Han maybe feels like a big brother to Luke now. He's looking out for him, and he worries about him, and he calls him Kid. I just love it when he calls him Kid. It's so cute. And they just see each other as friends. Maybe more. And you get the sense, too, that this may be one of the first true friends that Han has ever really had. Like, someone who's not in it for some ulterior motive and who doesn't really have anything to gain. And even though Han helps Luke, that's not really what Luke expects of him. And so you get the sense that this is Han's first real friendship with someone who's good. Like, who's a good person that he truly admires. It's just nice to see them have actual, genuine feelings for each other and being concerned about each other. And I think it's really important to both their development to have those kind of attachments. You also see C-3PO caring for R2-D2 in this, which is kind of sweet. He's worried about R2-D2 and if he's going to be safe, and you're like, oh, they're buddies. Which, side note though, C-3PO, is he the Jerry of Star Wars? And if you don't know what I mean by that, you should go watch a show called Parks and Recreation. It's very good. But there's a guy in Parks and Rec called Jerry in their office, and he's just the punching bag of that whole show. And honestly, one of the things I like the least about the show is the way they treat Jerry. You can tell that the writers just thought it was funny that they were coming up with these gags for the guy who plays Jerry to do, and it was funny, a little at first at least, using him as the punching bag for all these silly, mean jokes. But what ends up happening is that you have a really positive show that has a lot of really good, likable people who inexplicably bully someone largely over things that are outside of his control. And they're just mean to poor old Jerry. And the writers try to make up for it by giving Jerry a great, fulfilling personal life and a huge dick. That's an actual plot point in the show, but it's never really enough to make up for the kind of abuse that they put him through. And I just feel bad for C-3PO in this film because everyone kind of hates him. And he's always talking too much, and he is annoying. I know he's annoying, but I kind of love him a little bit, even if his timing's not great. He's often talking about the chances that people are going to be killed in moments that are emotionally fraught.
R2 says the chances of survival are 725 to 1.
Which works somewhat as a comic relief. This moment was getting a little too heavy and a little too real, and oh my god, Luke could really be dead out there. So let's throw C-3PO in there to lighten things up a little by speculating on his death. And it kind of takes you out of it, and it reminds you that Luke's not going to die here. It's not that big of a deal. And so maybe that helps the children or something. I don't know. He also interrupts Han and Leia's first kiss, which I just love. I just love that he walks in there. It's so funny. They're having this moment, and Han is talking to Leia, and it's getting very tense. And this is the first time, I think, you really see it from Leia's perspective. She's still saying, oh no, I'm not into that. I'm not into bad boys. That's not what I want. But also he's just like inches from her face. He just keeps getting closer, closer, closer. And you're like, okay, Leia, if you really weren't into this, you had a lot of opportunities to pull back and be like, back up. I don't want you to touch me. But he's still holding her hands, and she's giving this protest of like, oh no, my hands are dirty, but she's not pulling them away and being like, go away. She's still really close, and they're really close. And so it builds and builds up to this kiss. And it's one of those finally kisses. I love a finally kiss. We're just waiting and waiting for these two people to put their faces together. God damn it. And you're just like, yes, it's all paid off. And then C-3PO walks in, he's just like, hey guys, what's that? How's it going? And it's just so funny. Like, I don't know why, but I love that. I love the way that Leia just kind of slinks away. Like, I'm just going about my day. And then she just kind of pretends that it didn't really happen from that point. It's a great out for both of their characters. They can avoid having to confront what just happened between them, and they don't have to decide if they're going to do something else or act on it. It's just a moment that they're able to kind of put aside. And they do for a little while. But poor old C-3PO, he gets a lot of abuse in this film. Han puts his hand over his mouth, gets switched off at one point by Leia because she just thinks he's being too annoying. And even when C-3PO is right, even when our boy knows what's up, he's just like, the ship? Oh, this is the problem. Why don't you fix that? And even then, Han can't can't admit that C-3PO knows what he's talking about.
I think we better replace the negative power coupling.
So I think he's kind of the punching bag of this world, but he's still great. I like that even though he's the punching bag, and even though he knows it, and he acknowledges that everyone's just awful to him all the time, he doesn't change. He doesn't even try to. He's a droid, and he's been programmed to be a certain way, so I guess he's got to check his programming.
If someone programmed you to jump off a bridge, would you do it?
I'll have to check my program. Yep.
To see if he's allowed to change. But droids seem to have some sort of agency, some sort of personality, and he seems like a character that would be introspective enough to be able to be like, oh, I'm annoying everybody. Could you change my programming until I stop being so annoying? He's a manners and protocol etiquette droid that is supposed to help with social situations, but he's always annoying to everyone who's around him all the time. It seems like he should have some awareness of that he's getting on everyone's nerves, and it's really funny to me that he doesn't seem to. His whole purpose is to smooth over social situations, and all he really does is make them awkward and make everyone unhappy. I love it. I love the irony of that. It's great. Another connection that I think is interesting in this film is between Luke and Leia, because there's still sort of a romantic connection between them here. They had a couple of moments in the first film. It's clear that Luke is definitely into Leia. It's unclear how much of that's because of Leia is Leia, and how much of it is because she's a princess that he's got to help and save, and also that he's grown up on Tatooine on a farm and probably hasn't had a lot of options up to this point. All of his friends seem to be guys, and there don't seem to be a whole lot of women on the planet. So maybe you can see why Luke at 19 would see someone like Leia, who is stunning, and be like, hell yeah, Princess Leia. And Leia, for her part, seems to be interested in Luke somewhat. You can tell that it's not the same interests, perhaps that someone like Han sparks in her, but she at least has some sort of admiration for Luke. And again, you can kind of see an echo of an original outline where Luke and Han were meant to be rivals for Leia's affection. But wow, is it a little weird to watch that kiss now, knowing their eventual relationship. It's clearly a revenge kiss, and maybe this is actually one of the strongest moments that shows Leia's true feelings and affections for Han, that she feels the need to do this, that she kisses Luke to make a point to Han. I don't think that she's the kind of person who would kiss Luke if she didn't feel anything for him at all. She's not that cruel or manipulative. I think she does have some sort of feelings for Luke, but a lot of this is really her trying to prove to Han that he's wrong about her, and maybe a little trying to prove to herself that this is what she actually wants and not Han. And I think what's really nice about that is that it works. Han does look upset by the moment, seeing the person that he's clearly very much in love with kissing someone else. It does exactly what Leia wants it to do. It triggers him a little. He's a little like, oh, maybe I read the situation wrong. Or at least he's confused, if not by her actions, then maybe by how it makes him feel. And I think that's a nice thing about it. But watching that kiss is kind of uncomfortable. But I don't think at this point they'd really figured out that Leia was going to be Luke's sister. I think they'd written a draft where Luke did have a sister, but they hadn't assigned that role to Princess Leia yet. And their connection through the Force is really the first sign that Leia could also be Force sensitive, which I don't think is really a concept they had at this point either. So that could also be Luke just being able to use his powers or whatever. But that he calls to her at all, regardless of how or why it works, does show their bond. And making their bond exist because they're brother and sister stops her from having to let Luke down and say, I choose Han and not you because I think Han's better. That would have been kind of awkward. So they give her a really strong excuse for why she shouldn't be with Luke, or at least it would be strong in most things that aren't Game of Thrones. So other than the connections between the characters, there are also some fun connections between this film and the first one, some of which would eventually be overdone in the other 7 films, not even including the Star Wars stories. But at this point, the references were fun. We have the arms getting chopped off. Your arms and hands just aren't safe in Star Wars. They have arms flying off left and right, and all kinds of arms just getting detached. You also have the Imperial incompetence. The Imperial forces are not the smartest guys. As I said in my previous review, I'm generally okay with the way that their organization is shown, where there are occasionally guys with good ideas, but they get overruled by poor leadership. There's so much I could say about how that's very similar to most office environments, but I'll leave that alone for now. I don't mind the terrible leadership within the Imperial forces. I like the running gag in this where Darth Vader keeps killing the Admiral, and then he elevates the captain to Admiral to replace him right on the spot, and then that guy fails, and then he replaces him again. And you could just imagine the guy who's just been promoted to Admiral being like, oh great, really did it this time. Should not have shown myself to be competent enough to get promoted. Like, if I were an Imperial, I'd really phone it in, or at least I would try my best not to stand out. I'd be okay with being a grunt. I wouldn't seek power or promotion, because that way lies death by Darth Vader, you know? I guess if you're a stormtrooper, you've got a pretty decent chance of dying by one of the heroes of the story, so that's not great. I don't know. I would take my chances against Luke and Han and Leia and everybody who's got a blaster in this versus Darth Vader, who basically kills people just because they didn't do something that Darth Vader thought they should have done. The first admiral in particular, poor guy, he's killed by Darth Vader because he basically reveals that the Empire is coming to attack the base on Hoth. But the rebels already knew that. They found the Imperial probe droid, and so they already knew about the Imperial threat and that they were coming, but Darth Vader kills this guy anyway. And generally, all the leadership is shown to be pretty incompetent and pretty disappointing to Darth Vader, and he's always kind of annoyed by them. And it's fun to watch the bad guys, who are clearly the stronger power here, still struggle because they're dumb in a believable way. It's not like, oh, they're so stupid, like how could they do this? That's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. A couple of guys in there actually have the right idea. They know, and they're trying to tell somebody, but then their leadership is like, no, you're wrong. And then Darth Vader has to come in and be like, actually, the first guys were right. But does he give them any praise? No. Darth Vader's very withholding. He's a very withholding leader, and he probably would be a very withholding father, so maybe Luke and Leia are better off anyway. In another connection between the films, you've also got a bit of a mirrored arc between Han's A New Hope arc and Lando's arc here in Empire. He's a guy who's in it for himself, or at least in it for the city that he's the leader of, and he initially betrays them. You can tell that he doesn't really have much of a choice in that, but he does initially betray the fact that they're here to the Empire, who showed up first and threatened him. I don't really hold it too much against Lando here. He later helps them to escape, and that mirrors the arc that Han has, where he's going to abandon the rebels at their most desperate moment, and then comes back just in time to save Luke. So that's a fairly similar trajectory to what Lando goes through here. We don't get to see Lando quite as much as we see Han in the first film, but they do give him a similar arc, which serves to endear him to us in much the same way it did with Han. A final connection, or at least the final one that I'm going to talk about here, between the films is the concept of concealed identities. In the first movie, we don't know who Obi-Wan Kenobi is when Leia mentions him in her distress call. Luke knows Ben Kenobi. Sounds kind of like it. I mean, it's pretty close, but we don't know that Ben is Obi-Wan and not just a relative of Obi-Wan until he reveals that after Luke asks him. And the hidden identity theme continues throughout the entire saga. In this one, we have Yoda, who conceals his identity to Luke when he first meets him, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But we also, of course, have the big reveal, spoilers, for a more than 40-year-old film, that Darth Vader is Luke's father. I think I already said that a couple of times, but just in case. And there's even more connections that are still hidden. Luke and Leia's relationship to each other still hasn't been revealed by the end of this movie. But let's go back and talk a little bit more about Luke and what he's going through in this film, because he's kind of disconnected from the rest of the plot, and we'll do that here in part 5, Luke's training. So before we get into Yoda and everything that happens to Luke in this film, just a quick side note about Mark Hamill here. I'm a hardcore Luke stan. I love Luke, but every time I watch this movie, I remember something that my parents told me when I saw this film for the first time as a kid. They warned me that Mark Hamill had been in a car accident between the first film and the second one, and that he looked a little different here. And I honestly didn't really see it. I didn't see it when I was a kid. Now I can see it, but only because I'm really looking for it. I mean, he does look different if you look at the shots side by side from A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back. You can tell that his nose and his cheek were broken in the car accident. But overall, he still looks like Mark Hamill. He's really cute in A New Hope, and he's really cute in Empire Strikes Back. And honestly, current Mark Hamill can still get it. I'm not gonna lie to you, like, he can get it. But there's a rumor that the Wampa attack in the beginning of Empire Strikes Back, where the big monster comes and gets Luke, and that was put in the film as part of the explanation for why his face looks so different. That rumor's been denied various points, and if it did happen, I just don't see why that would have been necessary. I mean, the guy was in a serious car accident. It's not like he got a nose job. He was lucky to be alive. And so I just thought it was strange that there was so much emphasis on his changed appearance. But anyway, so Luke starts out this film as a commander, and he's leading a fighter squad. I think it's great that he's earned that position now through his actions in the destruction of the Death Star and everything that's happened over the past 3 years. He's now a leader in this rebellion when he was just a grunt in the Death Star battle. And Luke seems like a competent leader. In the first big fight scene where the Empire does the land assault on Hoth, the part where they bring down the AT-ATs, which, side note, man, that's fun to play in video games. I've played it in several Star Wars video games. I've gone flying around those AT-ATs to bring them down, and it's like always a joy. They're not necessarily the best in terms of weapon design, the walkers. They seem a little easy to defeat, like they just blow up as soon as they're on the ground, which is not really the best thing considering it's a ground assault unit. But anyway, Luke's gunner's killed, so he has to direct Rogue 2 to grapple the walker, and it's a nice detail where Luke gives the direction instructions rather than doing the job himself, and you get a sense that he's a good and respected leader. So it's a little confusing when he abandons his friends just moments later. He tells R2, we're not going to regroup with those guys. They're still fighting, by the way. They're still being pursued by the Imperial forces. They've not gotten out of this yet. And in fact, they can't because their hyperdrive is disabled. And so they can't make the jump to light speed. They can't really go anywhere. But Luke doesn't bother to find that out because earlier, dead Obi-Wan Kenobi's ghost told him he's got to go to Dagobah and find Yoda and finish his training. Damn it, Obi-Wan. I mean, I guess Obi-Wan learned from the prequels he isn't supposed to have any attachments as a Jedi. And so he callously disregards everyone except Luke in this film too. But ultimately, I think splitting Luke off here was a really good choice. It really lets us delve very deeply into Luke's journey, and not just his hero's journey in this, but really his emotional journey as he processes what happened to Obi-Wan and what he went through on the Death Star. And he comes to terms with his new abilities and learns more about the Force, all leading up to the reveal of his heritage. We go through a lot with Luke on Dagobah that would have been a lot harder to go through if all of his friends were there too. So it was pretty smart that they split him off. And when Luke does arrive on Dagobah, he crashes right into the swamp and he's immediately in this bad situation. And so when he comes across Yoda, he's already a bit annoyed that this is where he's ended up, and he immediately disregards the strange and tiny creature. Luke is looking for this great warrior. He's looking for someone who's going to train him, this Jedi Knight of acclaim, someone that Obi-Wan respects and who he thinks is the right person to teach Luke the ways of the Force. And so Luke is expecting, I don't know, I guess a 6'5" kind of guy who's gonna wield like triple lightsabers or something, and that's just not what he gets. Yoda doesn't reveal that he's Yoda initially. He's just acting really weird and really silly, and that puppet's just great. I love the Yoda puppet, and I wish they would still use the Yoda puppet. CGI Yodas have come a long way, and they're more expressive, and yes, but there's just something wonderful about that puppet, how real it looks in the scenes with Luke, and I would just love it if we'd go back to it. But anyway, Yoda is definitely very weird, very eccentric, and far stranger and more alien and unusual than Obi-Wan was. And he's also small and old, and I think there's a great lesson here about the nature of the Force and the nature of power generally, about how physical strength and prowess don't automatically make someone more powerful in this world or ours. There's a lesson about not judging a book by its cover and not allowing your expectations and assumptions about who someone is to stop you from seeing their real power, from seeing who they really are. And I think it also harkens back to the first movie's theme about the power of the individual and how even the smallest ship, even the smallest single individual, even someone as tiny and unassuming as Yoda, can really make a big difference. So Yoda's training with Luke, I mean, there's some great scenes in this. This is one of the all-time great training. It's not really a montage, but there's some parts of it where I'm kind of like, Yoda, that's not really the best advice, man.
Size matters not.
Actually can see what he's trying to say most of the time, but I do think sometimes the way it's written is kind of questionable. One of the first things Yoda does is basically admonish Luke for seeking adventure and having his eyes on the future and not being present. And I get what he's going for there. This is one of those kinds of lessons that I feel like pretty much every therapist or counselor tries to teach you, but frankly, it's one that I've never learned because I'm the kind of person who, just like Luke, has their eyes on the future and the next best thing all the time. And so maybe that lesson's just lost on me because I'm just not that kind of in the present person. And it's not that I'm rash or impulsive, which I don't think Luke really is either, but it's just that I'm interested in how much better things could be and what I need to do to get to a place that is better than the place I'm in. And I always feel that way, even when I'm happy. And so I just thought it was kind of weird that Yoda's telling Luke, you shouldn't be like that. But it doesn't really seem like that quality of Luke's is really bad or dangerous. Maybe he's impatient, but that could be because he's always wanted to be part of this and he wants to master the Force and become a Jedi overnight, not just for his personal glory, but so he can get back into this fight. And I don't think there's really anything wrong with that. He wants to be as useful as quickly as he can, and maybe he'd be willing to rush things a little to make that happen. I don't know, I just don't really see that being such a bad thing. Then Yoda goes and he tries to explain the dark side to Luke, and he says that it's not stronger than the light side, but it's quicker, easier, more seductive, but also that it will consume you. The dark side, light side thing in Star Wars, I struggle with it a lot. And not just because it seems kind of ambiguous, but actually that is most of my problem with it. I mean, how is what Luke does in the first film, where he fires the missiles into the Death Star and it explodes and that kills thousands of people, if not more than that, not a dark side of the Force thing? Is it because his motivation there is good, even though thousands of people die due to his actions? And then wanting to seek revenge against Darth Vader for killing Obi-Wan is a dark side action. But killing him because he kills other people generally, not people Luke knows, but just people is okay, and in fact exactly what Obi-Wan's ghost and Yoda want him to do. I mean, I guess you can say revenge is usually not something that's motivated from a good place in someone's heart, but also Inigo Montoya was out there for some revenge.
Hello. My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die.
And I was really there with him on that journey. I know that revenge can definitely be something that consumes you. It consumes Inigo for like 20 years or something, and then he doesn't really know what to do with his life next after he's done. But I also don't know that that necessarily makes him evil. I'm definitely rooting for Inigo throughout the movie. Stopping Darth Vader, fighting him, which is also, again, explicitly what Yoda and Obi-Wan's ghost want Luke to do, could be a path to the dark side if Luke goes at it through anger, whereas I guess the killing of thousands and thousands of people was okay because Luke's motivation for doing it was good. I mean, maybe there's something there about the reason behind the actions versus their consequences, but disregarding those consequences entirely, I don't know. Sure, his motivations were good to put a stop to this evil empire and the Death Star, a planet-destroying weapon, but there was a lot of collateral damage there. You can't think that every single person that was aboard the Death Star was a bad person who deserved death. The whole argument about who deserves to live and die, it's complicated and messy, and I don't know that it can easily be sorted into this light and dark side argument like it is in Star Wars. I like the take on it from Lord of the Rings, where Gandalf is talking to Frodo because Frodo thinks that Gollum deserves to die. And basically Gandalf is like, yeah, maybe he did deserve to die. Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death and judgment, for even the very wise cannot see all ends. I think it's funny that Yoda and Obi-Wan both admit that they can't actually see the future definitively, that the future is shifting and changing, and that they don't really clearly know what's going to happen. They just get the sense from the Force that Luke has an important role to play, and they think that they're going to be able to use him, and they do kind of use him here, like a pawn in this story in some ways, to kill Darth Vader and the Emperor and put an end to the evil empire, and that's ultimately going to be a good thing for the galaxy, but they don't know that for certain, and so, like, I don't know, I just come away from this as skeptical of the Jedi. It's pretty clear that the Empire's bad. They're evil. There's really not much of an argument to be made that there's anything good or redeeming about the Empire. We never really see anything, at least in these first two films, other than their oppressive military force and comically evil leadership. Like, where are all the bureaucrats? Where are the people who are collecting the taxes and paving the roads or space roads or whatever the fuck? Like, we don't really see much beyond just the military, and they're just straight up evil. But the Jedi as a force for good is something that I'm a little more skeptical of, because it just seems like their philosophy is a little unclear. There's another good scene in this where Yoda's explaining the Jedi's use the Force for knowledge and defense. I guess kind of a warrior monk thing. And then Luke begins to ask a question that starts with why, and Yoda's like, no, this is where the training stops. I'm done teaching you today. Clear your mind of questions. And it's like, well, if Jedi use the Force for knowledge, how is Luke supposed to get that knowledge? Is he allowed to just know things, but when he asks why and he wants to understand them, that's where the line is? Like, it's weird that Yoda's like, no. Stop asking questions, you fool. One breath after he's just said that they use the Force for knowledge. Come on, Yoda. It's a little confusing. There's a lot of confusing, ambiguous stuff in the training montage. Cave scene's another good one. Yoda tells Luke that the dark side is strong in the cave, but he's not going to need weapons there. It's up for interpretation, but what I take from it is that Luke is facing the dark side of himself and going into the dark place of his own psyche. Luke disregards Yoda, takes his weapons in, and of course he sees Darth Vader there, and he fights him and wins. But when he decapitates Darth Vader, it's his own head in the helmet. And I suppose it means that by giving in to the dark side of the Force, giving in to his fear and anger, and that being the motivation for taking down Darth Vader, it literally destroys him. And I think that works. I think it does make sense. But it's just a little strange that his end goal is to kill Darth Vader. That is what they want him to do. And I guess they're just trying to get him to a place where his motivation behind that is pure. And it's no longer this corrupt motivation of just revenge for himself and for the person that he's lost, but for the good of the galaxy. That's what he needs to be feeling in order to actually win in this fight without destroying himself. Which, okay, that kind of works. Another scene that's interesting here is the scene where Luke can't raise the X-Wing doing because he doesn't believe it's possible. He definitely backtracks here, right? Because he believes in the Force and he believes in what Obi-Wan tells him in the first film so readily. And I think that it's kind of nice that you can see some of why Luke has his doubts. I mean, he's been using the Force a little bit. He uses it to get his lightsaber to escape the Wampa in the beginning. But other than that one big moment where he destroys the Death Star with it, and ultimately he's just guiding a couple of missiles really. He's not blowing up the Death Star with the power of his mind or anything. So maybe you can see how he could underestimate what the Force is really capable of, even though he'd come to terms with the acceptance of the Force and what it was previously. So let's talk about how Luke leaves this situation where he's training with Yoda, because this training isn't done. We don't really know what it would look like if the training were done because he leaves early and he's the only one who really goes through this type of training, but he sees his vision through the Force of his friends in pain in the Cloud City, Bespin, which, side note, how does everyone know where everything is? These guys are pretty good at geography in this world. Like, I don't know if I saw a vision of my friends in some random place, if I'd be able to name the exact city within our own real world, even places that I've been to, let alone a place that I've never been to before. But yeah, okay, he sees them in pain and he decides it's time to go. He's got to go save his friends. So again, what is wrong with the Jedi in this moment? I know this scene was rewritten. Originally, Obi-Wan did tell him to go and rescue his friends, and then they rewrote it to have it be Luke's choice, which I ultimately think is good that Luke makes that call himself. But the part where Obi-Wan and Yoda are trying to talk him out of going is always kind of strange to me. I think I get what the scene is trying to say. It's that Luke hasn't finished his training, and that if he fights Darth Vader now, which is probably what he's walking into, he'll lose. Or he could lose, or he could fall to the dark side and become the ruler himself alongside Darth Vader, which is what Darth Vader wants or says he wants. And I think that they're afraid for Luke that that's what's going to happen, and that all the training and all the things he and his friends have done and the cause they've all fought for would have been for nothing if he goes now. I get that's what they're saying, but the way they say it, it sure does sound a lot like, let your friends die, Luke, who cares?
You must not go.
But Han and Leia will die if I don't.
You don't know that.
Which reminds me a bit of the scene in Man of Steel where Pa Kent tells young Clark off after he saved a school bus full of kids. He's like, man, you shouldn't have done that, son, because you really put yourself at risk. And Clark is like, what was I supposed to do? Just let them die? And Pa Kent is like,
maybe.
When I first saw that scene, I was like, what the fuck, Pa Kent? I mean, I see what he's saying. Your identity is important. We don't want you to get taken away by the government to be tested like the space alien that you are. And we need to do something to try to protect you and to conceal that. But what he actually says is maybe just let the kids die next time. And that's a little hard to understand. You know, it doesn't really seem in keeping with a good character. It just seems selfish and needlessly short-sighted. I mean, couldn't you just tell Clark to put on a ski mask next time? Couldn't he just say, I'm proud of you, son, for saving all those people's lives, but also that was a risk to yourself. We've got to figure out a solution so that they don't identify you next time. But don't stop saving people, because it's really good that you did that, and that's who you are. And I think this moment here where Obi-Wan and Yoda are telling Luke not to go, what they're trying to say is not that they don't care about his friends. They're just telling him to think more about it, but it still comes off a little callous. So it's good that Luke's like, no, I'm gonna go and I'll do the best I can with what I've learned so far, but I'm not gonna let them die, especially not for me. And so it's nice that Luke has that moment for his character where he decides something against the advice of his mentors, even if that advice was a little nonsensical. He strikes out on his own, really for the first time, and he's coming into his own as a person, who he is and what he values. And the thing that he values is his friendship with these people. And I think that's good, it works. But it's still kind of funny because Yoda and Obi-Wan are like, oh no, you'll get lured to the dark side. And they don't really seem to trust Luke or understand him. And sure, they've been burned before with Darth Vader, but also they kind of set him up to be tempted by Darth Vader by withholding a critical piece of information, you know? Maybe they could have given him a heads up about who Darth Vader was to him. They're all worried that Luke's going to be tempted to the dark side, but I feel like that was more likely because they didn't tell him what he was about to face. They could have been like, well, by the way, Darth Vader's actually your dad, so he's going to try to use that to recruit you, and you should try not to fall for that. I mean, would it have ruined one of the greatest reveals in movie history? Yeah. So ultimately, I can't say that I'm mad that they just left that out, but it also kind of undermines the Jedi and undermines Yoda and Obi-Wan and their motivations in this. They don't give Luke that very critical piece of information until the moment that he really has to make a decision about it. Maybe there's something to be said there about giving him the agency to make that choice. And maybe they do trust him that he'll make the right decision. But if the fate of the galaxy is in their hands, I feel like they really should have helped him succeed as much as possible. Obi-Wan says that the boy is our last hope. Yoda's like, no, there is another. Who's that? I guess Leia, maybe? But then why would they be so cavalier about her dying here? Or maybe they think that Anakin could still come back to the light. Or maybe they were going to write another character in and this left them some opening to do that and then they decided against it. But it's kind of a weird line. And it's also kind of strange that there's really only one other option. What were they doing for the past 19 years or so between the events in which Luke and Leia are born and the beginning of A New Hope when they're 19, you know? What were Obi-Wan and Yoda doing this whole time? They say something like, we've got to watch and wait for them to choose this path for themselves. But like, did they really have no other plans to defeat the Empire? I mean, I guess they just decided that if Luke and Leia chose to follow the paths themselves into the Force and join the right side of things, they would help guide them. But ultimately they had to choose their own fate. Like, if they didn't do that, guess the galaxy's just fucked then. They didn't really seem like they had any other ideas. No other people they could have trained. I get that this is a chosen one thing and it's their heritage, the Skywalker family, but like, I don't know. I feel like if I were those guys, I would have pulled a few kids in there that were Force sensitive. It seems like there are a lot of people who are Force sensitive, at least in the sequel trilogy, and just have a go at training them up to be Jedi. Train them in secret and just kind of see what happens. And maybe those can be my backup kill Darth Vader pawns in this thing. I don't know. I guess there's some kind of Force-related reason for not doing that, but it just seems kind of annoying that they put the whole fate of the galaxy into Luke's hands, or maybe Leia's or Anakin's or whoever, but whoever they're talking about, they didn't give themselves a lot of options. But let's talk a little bit more about Anakin, or as he's known in this film, Darth Vader, in Part 6, Darth Vader. So Darth Vader, one of film's greatest villains of all time. He is pretty great in this. He is pretty enjoyable to watch. Like I said earlier, I love the part where he's just kind of killing off those admirals because they're messing things up and they're incompetent. And he's just like, what does a guy have to do around here to get something done? Can no one fix this printer? Guess I'll have to just murder people. I mean, it's pretty good. It's pretty enjoyable watching that. But some of the changes that were made to this film and the special edition re-edit kind of confused Darth Vader's character a little bit. In the opening crawl, it says Darth Vader is obsessed with finding Luke Skywalker. And so, okay, couple things on that. How does he know it was Luke that destroyed the Death Star? Is Rebellion just that leaky that they let that information out? I guess maybe they found out at some point during the last 3 years. Maybe they've got some spies embedded within the Rebellion. Or maybe he can just sense that it's Luke Skywalker and knows the name through the Force. But then there's the Skywalker of it all. There's a conversation that Darth Vader has with those Imperial officers in the beginning where he says, that's the base on Hoth, and I bet Skywalker's with them. So he knows it's Luke, and he knows it's Luke Skywalker, but also he doesn't see the connection there with himself. Anakin Skywalker, his original name. Like, what is that? Or maybe he just pretends that he doesn't see the connection. Because when we see the Emperor for the first time, the Emperor tells him that they've got this new enemy, Luke Skywalker, and Vader's like, yeah, I know that. And the Emperor's like, well, that's the son of Anakin Skywalker. And Vader's like, how could it be? I mean, how common is Skywalker as a last name that Vader was like, nah, that's probably not my kid. I had a couple of kids, but that's just a coincidence, right? Skywalker. Is it like Smith, Johnson, Skywalker in this world? I mean, I think realistically, this is probably just a holdover from an earlier draft where Luke wasn't Vader's son. The second draft of this movie is where they put that detail in the first time. George Lucas claims that it was always the case, but I don't know if I really believe that. In the scene with the Emperor, the bit about Anakin was actually added with the special editions to align it better with the prequels. And yeah, technically that adds a little more continuity there. And sure, so does replacing the actor with the guy who plays the Emperor later on. But also it makes the whole thing about Darth Vader not realizing this is his child kind of awkward. And I guess you could read it as Darth Vader's pretending he doesn't know and hasn't worked it out yet because Darth Vader is working against the Emperor because he has his own plan, which is to recruit Luke and to overthrow the Emperor. So that's a reading of it that I think works, that Darth Vader is kind of feigning ignorance here. But it's not really shot that way to let us us know that he's lying. But anyway, Vader really seems to know a lot about Luke. He uses Han and Leia and Chewbacca and even poor old C-3PO, who's in a bunch of pieces, to lure him into a trap. How does he know that these are Luke's friends and that these are the rebels that Luke is going to come and rescue? I mean, the rebellion's pretty split up now, right? They got split up after the attack. I guess they were supposed to rendezvous somewhere, but I imagine that there are some people that are in different places. And so how does he know that these are the people that Luke would come and rescue? How does he know about their friendship and the connection between them? And again, you can kind of hand wave the Force whenever there's some kind of question like this. The answer is always through the magic of the Force. He knows the power of friendship and understands the connections that Luke has and uses that against him. But it's fairly convenient that the Force can let you know the past and the present and some version of the future, only sometimes and not when you're specifically needing information. Maybe the Force lets Vader know what Luke is going to do, and it lets him know how to trap Luke. But it doesn't let him know enough to actually see Luke's decision to not go along with him. And it doesn't really help him in the first film when he's trying to find the rebel base location. Like, you feel like you could just use the Force and find Leia or maybe Luke or whoever. And I don't know if this has to be one of his children or Force sensitive, or if he can just use the Force to see what other people are doing. This is one of the problems with the soft magic system. Brandon Sanderson talks about the distinction between hard magic with defined rules and boundaries and soft magic, where it can kind of just do anything the writers need it to. And so Star Wars has a soft magic system where it's not really clear to us all the possibilities and limitations for the Force, and so they just kind of use it wherever it's narratively needed, which I think largely works, but occasionally breaks down a little bit. So after Vader lures Luke into the trap, he decides that he's going to carbon freeze Luke to send him to the Emperor. This is a little confusing because it isn't clear if Vader actually intends to carbon freeze Luke to send him to the Emperor. Once they begin fighting, it seems like his real plan was to talk Luke into joining him, and then they'll overthrow the Emperor together. Or maybe that's just a trick too, and if Luke had agreed to join him, Vader would have just killed him. But if he is actually planning on bringing Luke to the Emperor, why does he need to freeze him at all? What's the purpose of the carbon freezing? Is it that far away? Will Luke not survive the journey? If that's the case, then why can Darth Vader survive it? Is it because of his suit? What about everyone else who's going to be on the ship? Is this just like to keep Luke in prison because otherwise Luke could escape? Why wouldn't some handcuffs work? Is it a Force thing that you've got to freeze people if you want to hold them as prisoner? Couldn't you just kind of sedate him or something and keep him asleep for most of the journey? I mean, I guess that's what carbon freezing achieves, but it's really strange that this is shown as the first time anyone has tried this through the scene with Han, where they decide to test it because it might actually kill him. It's like, but what did they need the solution for in the first place? Why did they even need to do this? Regardless, it's a really cool scene visually. It looks great. I love that set. I love the glowing orange and the blue, and the way the whole thing looks is wonderful. And it also sets up that wonderful moment with Leia and Han. I still don't really know why they needed this in the film, but I'm so glad they left it anyway because it's a really great scene. But anyway, Luke doesn't end up in the carbon freeze because he challenges Vader to a duel, or just starts fighting him, I guess. And that duel is great. It's not a wonderful sword fight. There aren't many in the original trilogy, but it's just a great emotional scene of their conflict finally coming to a head. And it feels in some ways watching them fight is a little bit like watching Leia and Han kiss. It's a finally fight. Like, yes, finally. They're finally going to fight because Obi-Wan gets to fight Vader in the first one. So we don't get to see Luke and Vader go up against each other until the end of Empire. And finally, here at the very end of the film, we get to see them fight. And Luke really holds his own in this. He does pretty well considering everything. I mean, he loses his hand, but he's not dead. And then we have just one of the most iconic moments in all of film.
No, I am your father.
It's just great. Mark Hamill's reaction to that is pretty wild. But it works. It makes sense that after Luke spent more than 3 years trying to kill this guy, their worst enemy and the man who killed Luke's mentor, the person they've been running from or fighting against all this time, and when Luke finally gets his shot to take him out, this is what he gets for it. A lot of people lied to him. Obi-Wan and Yoda have basically lied to him, and Luke is feeling that betrayal in that moment. It's not just that he's upset by the truth here, but that the truth necessarily means that the people who are important to him betrayed him and didn't reveal this very important information to him till he had to find out the hard way. And again, that doesn't necessarily make sense for these good characters who are meant to be empowering this kid to save the galaxy, but boy does it make for a great twist. It's probably one of the best twists in cinema. I don't know that a twist like this will ever happen again. Today, it would probably be shot on someone's smartphone and released months before the film came out. There's basically no keeping a secret anymore. Now, if you want to be unspoiled on something, that's an effort you have to make, because the spoilers will be out there and you will see them. And so, I don't know if we'll ever get a scene as good as this again. I would say say that some of the twists in Game of Thrones kind of approached it, but those books had already been published for years. So there was a huge number of people who already knew. So from the perspective of most of the audience going into this with no idea what they were going to see, I don't think we're going to have that again. Maybe ever. But back to Luke. Luke basically declines the offer. He's calculating a little like a cat and jumping off this ledge when the join me thing comes up again with Rey and Kylo Ren in The Last Jedi. And I really wanted her to say yes. I really, really did. I think that would have been by far the most interesting choice if she were pushed to the dark side in her worst place. And that was something that actually originally was discussed as a possibility for Luke here. They'd considered having Luke temporarily fall to the dark side and then coming back to the light. And while I think that would have been really great for Rey's character, I don't know that it would have worked for Luke, and I'm kind of glad that they didn't go for it. He isn't really tempted, even after his betrayal, at least not in this film. But after Leia finds Luke and he's back on the ship, he's like, Ben, why didn't you tell me? And it's a really great question. Like I said, the doubts that this betrayal creates in Luke, I feel like that's probably the most likely thing to pull him to the dark side. Obi-Wan and Yoda knew the truth. They knew who Luke's parents were. They knew that Leia was Luke's sister, and they didn't bother to reveal that to him either. And I would feel so betrayed if the people who trained me did that to me. And I would have questioned everything about my training. It really says something for Luke that he doesn't. That he's able to accept that he knows what he needs to know when he needs to know it, and that the people who trained him, while great, they weren't flawless. And he just continues on the same path without changing his mind. I think that they set it up for the possibility of him being tempted by the dark side, and that comes up a little bit more in the next film, but it's probably best that he isn't really. It doesn't really fit with Luke's character and who we've seen him become, but it would be kind of interesting to see, and I'm sure there's a fanfic out there that shows an alternate ending where Luke does fall to the dark side. I'll have to read it someday. So I think that covers roughly 10% of what I wanted to talk about when it comes to The Empire Strikes Back. Is this my favorite Star Wars film? Maybe. I do think it's a great movie. And even though there's not a ton plot-wise that happens, the character development that happens in this is some of the best in any of the Star Wars movies. And there are some iconic moments and scenes that have been referenced so many times that it's hard to remember what the original versions were even like. I mean, most people say, "Luke, I am your father," a line that's never said. That's what everyone remembers. But from the perspective of do I rewatch this movie a lot? I don't. I actually rewatch A New Hope a lot, and I think it's just because it stands better on its own. I usually only rewatch Empire if I'm watching all 3 of the films in the trilogy. I do something similar with Lord of the Rings. I rewatch Fellowship of the Ring all the time. I've seen that movie so many times I could probably recite it, but I haven't seen the other 2 nearly as often. But from a filmmaking perspective, if Empire is not the greatest Star Wars film, and it probably is. Even if it's not my absolute favorite, it's probably my second favorite. It's a really good film, and it's one of the very best sequels ever made, and the quality kind of only goes downhill from here. There are some bright spots and moments in the next film, and in both of the other film trilogies, and I will always talk about the things that I like in addition to my criticisms, because again, I go to movies to enjoy them. I'm not going to just rag on them all day, but I do think that the tone of these reviews is going to take a pretty sharp turn relatively soon. But I hope you'll stay with me. I hope you'll hit that like and subscribe, and I hope you'll join me next week.
It's too big.
Size matters not.